In 1898, far from the towns and trails of the Ozark Mountains, there stood a cabin the locals would whisper about in hurried, fearful tones. Travelers who passed by would speak of shadows that moved behind its windows, and of a quiet that pressed against the skin like a weight no wind could lift. Inside that cabin lived the Vancroft sisters, known to the few who dared speak of them as children of strange habits, carrying out rituals so private, so hidden, that even the forest around their home seemed to shift in their presence. What compelled a family to retreat so completely into these practices? What beliefs, so firm and unyielding, could shape a household into a place that drew whispers from miles away, yet offered no clear answer to those who sought the truth? Before we continue, take a moment. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below if you're ready to follow every step of this story. Imagine living in that settlement, hearing the faint echo of their movements through the night, never knowing whether what you heard was the wind or something carefully guided by human hands. If you had passed that cabin, would you have stepped closer or turned and fled without looking back? Let me know in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from and what hour it is right now. The answer may tell us more about ourselves than it does about them. The woods surrounding the Vancroft cabin were unlike any other in the Ozarks. Moss clung to trees in thick green curtains, filtering the weak sunlight into uneven, shifting patches across the forest floor. The air was damp, smelling of wet bark, soil, and the faint metallic tang of the nearby river. Even the animals seemed cautious here. Birds would fall silent for minutes as though listening, and foxes and raccoons avoided the cabin as though it bore a warning they instinctively understood. The cabin itself was small, constructed of aged timber that sagged in places, its windows darkened with the soot of countless fires. Each night, the floorboards creaked beneath steps that no one outside ever heard approach. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching and twisting in ways that suggested the room itself had memory, remembering the movements of those who lived within. The wind through the pines whispered constantly, and sometimes it carried sounds faint and human, though no person was ever seen outside. Locals spoke of the sisters with caution. Few ventured near, and those who did returned with stories fragmented by fear. A light moving where it should not, the faint sound of voices murmuring in unison, objects rearranged in ways that suggested observation. Every description was carefully measured, as if speaking too loudly might summon the cabin's attention, as if the trees themselves recorded every step taken too close to the threshold. Night after night, the cabin seemed to awaken in ways the forest could not explain. It began with sounds too subtle to name at first. A soft, scraping noise against the wooden floorboards, barely audible, like fingernails tracing along the grain. Travelers who passed the edge of the woods swore they could hear it too, a rhythm almost deliberate, as though the building itself were performing a private ceremony. No one dared stay long enough to confirm what it was. Those who lingered, even for a few minutes, described an unease that clung to the chest and weighed the limbs, an inexplicable exhaustion that left the mind fraying at the edges. Occasionally the wind would shift, carrying a faint scent of something burned, yet no fire burned where they could see. Doors, long since barred from the inside, seemed to sigh with motion, and windows caught glimpses of movement that never repeated the same pattern twice. A branch might fall outside the cabin, and the sisters would be seen, not running from it, but moving with it, responding in ways that suggested the forest itself guided them. People in nearby settlements spoke quietly of these incidents, leaning close when they did, as if the words themselves might summon the cabin's notice. One traveler, a man unfamiliar with the terrain, recounted the first night he dared approach the ridge. He had seen the cabin by day and thought it unremarkable, just another weathered house cradled by the mountains. But that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the peaks, he heard a sound no human should ever hear. Faint chanting, carried faintly on the wind, almost beneath perception, yet perfectly synchronized in a way that suggested purpose. He froze, certain it came from inside the cabin. The voice did not rise or fall. It held steady, hypnotic, and for a long moment he could not distinguish how many people were inside, or whether the sound was human at all. The forest itself seemed to respond. The trees leaned slightly toward the cabin, their branches swaying as though they too listened. Even the river, normally gurgling and restless, stilled, its surface glassy and black. Every step closer became heavier, the path narrowing in ways that made escape uncertain. And yet, despite all this, some who ventured near swore they caught glimpses of the sisters through the windows, not peering out, but moving in patterns that seemed to belong to another time, another world, repeating the same motions over and over, as if rehearsing a script older than the mountains themselves. Local accounts, pieced together decades later, described nights when shadows would twist across the clearing, forming shapes that resembled figures, but shifted too fluidly for the mind to hold. Objects disappeared for hours, only to return in positions that seemed intentional. Visitors often reported that the longer they stayed near the cabin, the more disoriented they became. Hours would pass in what felt like minutes. Sounds would echo backward, and the line between what was real and imagined blurred with every heartbeat. Some claimed that even the moonlight behaved oddly, casting elongated shapes across the clearing that never matched the angles of the trees, as if the night itself had its own awareness of the cabin. Yet there were no screams, no cries of fear. The rituals, whatever form they took, were silent to the untrained ear. Their presence was a whisper, a suggestion, a feeling that one was always observed, even when entirely alone. It was in this quiet that dread took root, wrapping itself around the mind and heart of anyone who dared approach. It is said that some never returned, while those who did came back, changed. Their hands trembled, their eyes darted to corners unseen, and they spoke in hushed tones of things they refused to name. By the time the moon hung high over the Ozark ridge, the cabin no longer appeared as a simple structure of timber and nails. Its walls seemed to breathe with the lives within, contracting and expanding as if the house itself were aware of every step taken nearby. Those who managed to catch a glimpse through the darkened windows spoke of figures moving with precision, shadows shifting across the walls, silhouettes bending and twisting in ways that defied natural posture. Every movement was deliberate, yet impossible to trace with certainty. Inside, the sisters performed what outsiders could only imagine. There were no screams, no chaos, only motions repeated over and over, patterns that suggested intent, practice, and devotion to something unseen. The air inside was said to feel heavier than outside, thick with a presence that seemed both human and something else entirely. Candles flickered as though struggling against a current invisible to the eye, throwing light across faces that seemed familiar, yet distorted in ways the mind refused to hold on to. One witness, who later spoke to a local chronicler, described the scene as if time itself slowed. "I could see their hands moving in unison, performing gestures that seemed both reverent and commanding, he said. The father stood behind them, silent, yet every motion appeared directed by him. And the shadows moved with the sisters, stretching across walls and ceiling, yet not bound to them. I could not tell where the shadow ended and the human began. Even as the witness retreated, he swore the cabin was aware of his presence. The flickering candlelight seemed to follow him, shadows spilling into the trees, forming shapes that lingered long after he had left the clearing. At times, it appeared that the sisters themselves paused and turned toward the darkness outside, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. And then, as suddenly as it began, the motions ceased. The cabin fell silent, the wind stilled, and the forest seemed to retreat from the edges of the clearing, leaving only the faint, echoing sense of an act completed, a ritual performed beyond comprehension. Observers often left with their minds stretched thin, struggling to reconcile what they had seen with what they knew to be possible. Did they witness human practices shaped by fear and belief, or had they glimpsed something that extended beyond mortal understanding? The ambiguity remained, and perhaps that uncertainty is what truly anchored the horror of the Vancroft cabin in memory, making it impossible for any who approached to forget the sight or the feeling of that night. The story of the Vancroft sisters did not end with a single night, nor with the fleeting glimpses of shadows through candlelight. Those who dared to stay near the cabin often returned to the settlement with fragments of experience, disconnected memories, as if the forest itself had rearranged the sequence of events. One account tells of a traveling merchant who, having camped near the ridge, awoke to a faint knocking on the cabin door at midnight. No sound accompanied the knock, only the echo within his chest, a vibration that seemed to pull him toward the structure. When he approached, the door remained locked, yet he was certain someone, or something, was waiting on the other side. Others spoke of whispers carried on the wind, incoherent but rhythmic, almost musical in their repetition. One young man, a neighbor who had dared to peek through a window while the sisters moved inside, recalled seeing hands moving over an object he could not identify. It was small, perhaps a book or a box, he later said. The motions were careful, deliberate, almost ceremonial. I could feel the weight of every gesture, as though it pressed against my mind. Even as he recounted it, he could not explain why he had survived that night, while another companion who stayed briefly behind him had fled screaming, claiming that the shadows had followed him into the woods. At times, the family's rituals seemed to intersect with the environment itself. Travelers described the wind bending unnaturally toward the cabin, carrying scents and whispers from distances that should have been impossible. Rain would sometimes begin abruptly over the clearing, while the surrounding woods remained dry. Animals, those instinctively attuned to danger, abandoned the ridge entirely, leaving the area eerily still. For those observing from afar, it was as if the forest itself recognized the importance of what occurred within the Vancroft home, and chose to give it space, to allow it to unfold in isolation. The father's presence was always a constant. Observers describe him as calm, almost unnervingly so, directing movements with an authority that required no speech. His gestures were minimal yet precise. A tilt of the head, a hand raised slightly, and the sisters responded immediately. It was said that he moved among them without touching, yet their movements followed his, as if the air itself carried his commands. Some whispered that his eyes reflected a knowledge older than the mountains, a certainty that unsettled those who tried to meet his gaze. Over the weeks and months, patterns emerged. The rituals took place mostly at night, but some observers claimed that even during the day, the sisters performed smaller, subtler motions, gestures repeated over and over, often near windows or in corners where shadows clung the thickest. One chronicler, years later, suggested that the sisters' actions were not intended for human observation, but for something that existed beyond the reach of ordinary sight. He wrote, "The movements have purpose, but the purpose is not ours to know. The forest watches, the shadows respond, and the Vancrofts exist within that continuum." There were nights when curiosity overtook fear. A group of 3 young men from the nearby settlement decided to map the patterns of light and shadow from a ridge opposite the cabin. They observed for hours, noting candle flickers and the positions of silhouettes. One recorded, with trembling hand, that the movements of the sisters were so precise, it seemed as though each gesture was choreographed for an audience that included something invisible, something that weighed the significance of every motion. When they attempted to retreat quietly, the wind shifted, carrying a faint echo of footsteps behind them, though no one had followed. They claimed to have glimpsed eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, reflecting candlelight from the cabin itself. The psychological toll on those who lingered near the cabin was profound. One woman, a traveling seamstress, spent a single night sketching the cabin's exterior, hoping to capture its layout for her journal. She awoke the next morning convinced that the sketches had changed overnight. Doors shifted, windows expanded, angles impossible to recreate. She tore the pages apart, yet swore she could still feel the lines of the building press against her vision whenever she closed her eyes. Others reported dreams of the cabin, rooms that stretched endlessly, floors that gave way beneath imagined feet, shadows crawling across walls that had no windows. Every account added to the mystery. Letters found decades later described faint voices heard through walls, chanting or speaking in a language unknown. The forest seemed to respond to these noises. Branches swayed without wind, streams gurgled unevenly, and the ambient sounds of the woods felt concentrated around the cabin. Travelers who accidentally stumbled across the clearing at dawn said the air was colder there, and a heaviness pressed on the chest, as if the location itself had a memory of the night's events. Among these tales, a single theme persisted. The Vancroft sisters were enmeshed in patterns beyond comprehension. Their gestures, their nightly routines, the way the cabin seemed alive, all pointed to a hidden logic, a careful design intended for eyes that were not human. And yet, despite the fear, observers could not look away. The more they watched, the more the tension built, until the forest, the cabin, and the sisters themselves became inseparable in the mind of anyone who lingered too long. By the end of these extended nights, those who survived to speak often carried an internal echo, a memory that seemed to replay itself in subtle ways, a movement in the corner of the eye, a shadow that lingered too long, or a sound just beneath perception. It was a dread that could not be named, yet it left an undeniable mark on anyone who approached the ridge, and cemented the cabin as a place of enduring terror, whispered about for decades afterward. As the nights stretched on, the cabin itself seemed to transcend its physical form. Those who ventured near during this period describe an almost magnetic quality, a sensation that the air drew them closer, despite every instinct screaming to turn away. Shadows moved with purpose, yet never followed the natural lines of the timber. Candlelight flickered in ways that suggested presence where none existed, and a low hum, subtle at first, began to thread through the forest like a pulse. It was not wind, not animal, not anything known. It was something else. The sisters' rituals intensified. Witnesses report that gestures became faster, more precise, almost rehearsed in perfect unison. Objects that had never moved before shifted between rooms, as if guided by invisible hands. The father, ever present, did not speak. He did not touch. He simply moved among them, a silent authority shaping the actions of the household with imperceptible gestures. Observers later admitted they could not tell if he was orchestrating the ritual, or if he too was responding to a force beyond comprehension. One chronicler wrote that, at times, the cabin seemed to stretch beyond its own walls. Windows appeared where none had been. Doors opened into empty voids, and hallways extended beyond the boundaries of space. It was as if the physical laws of the world bent around the rituals, responding to the movements of the sisters and the unspoken presence of their father. Even the forest outside seemed altered. Trees shifted slightly overnight, rocks moved, and paths that had been familiar twisted into unfamiliar shapes. On one night, a group of witnesses who had taken refuge in the tree line reported seeing a shadow detach from the cabin's structure itself. It hovered briefly, stretched upward like a column of darkness, and then vanished into the woods. The sisters did not notice. Their movements continued, rhythmic and precise, entirely focused on an invisible point that no outsider could perceive. The father stood at the center, a fixed point amid the motion, calm yet commanding. Those observing later described a sensation of being watched not by human eyes, but by something ancient, present, and calculating. The psychological terror became almost unbearable. Observers described feeling their own bodies betray them, hands shaking uncontrollably, legs refusing to move when they tried to retreat, and an acute awareness of every breath they drew. Even sounds were distorted. A twig snapping nearby seemed magnified into a gunshot. Whispers in the wind carried clear intention, as if speaking directly to their minds. One man recounted years later that he could see the sisters' movements replaying in his mind long after he had left, synchronized perfectly with shadows in his own home, making him question whether the forest had followed him. And yet, through all of this, the sisters' purpose remained a mystery. Was this ritual a family tradition, a protective measure, or a response to something far older than their own lives? The chronicler noted, every gesture, every motion carries weight beyond its form. They obey not only their father, but the rhythm of something vast and unnameable. Observers often left with their hearts pounding, minds fraying, and a lingering certainty that the cabin and the sisters existed in a space that overlapped with our own, yet remained entirely separate, impenetrable, and watchful. The peak horror did not come from screams or violence, but from realization. The house, the sisters, the father, and even the surrounding forest all belonged to a rhythm and logic inaccessible to outsiders. Time and space seemed malleable. Movement was amplified, meaning was obscured, and the very air carried the memory of the night's acts. Witnesses described feeling the weight of this unseen order pressing against them, a subtle terror more profound than anything overt, one that lingered long after they had escaped the ridge. And when the observers finally dared to retreat, the cabin appeared normal once more, as though no activity had occurred. Yet the hum persisted in the mind, the sense of observation remained, and the subtle, precise patterns of the sisters' gestures replayed endlessly in imagination. What they had seen could not be explained, yet the evidence of its impact endured, marking the forest the ridge, and all who approached with the inescapable feeling that something had unfolded beyond human understanding. Decades later, the cabin still stands, weathered by time, yet unchanged in presence. Those who return to the ridge speak of a feeling that cannot be shaken, a weight in the air, a silence that hums faintly, as though the echoes of the sisters' motions never left the walls. Travelers claim that the forest seems quieter here than anywhere else, and even the wind behaves differently, brushing against the skin like a memory. Some nights, locals swear they can hear faint gestures, the soft swish of movement in a room no longer occupied, the hint of ritual performed in a place now abandoned. And those who claim to have seen the sisters' movements, even fleetingly, admit that the memory has not faded. It replays in dreams, in reflections, and in shadows at the corner of the eye. What they witnessed may have been human, yet somehow it feels older, larger, a rhythm beyond comprehension. In the end, the Vancroft cabin is not simply a house. It is a presence, a living memory, and a warning. Some say curiosity led to fascination, fascination to dread, and dread to an understanding that there are forces and patterns in this world that one cannot touch, only observe, and never fully escape. Would you spend a single night alone near that ridge? Could you endure hours under a forest's watchful presence, where every shadow moves with intent, and every sound carries unknown meaning? Comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, what time it is, and whether you would dare step closer to the Vancroft cabin. And if you're still watching, then you are braver than most. Subscribe to Dark Room, where we explore the forgotten, the hidden, and the unexplained. Next time, we will venture to another ridge, another house, where the past refuses to stay buried, and what we uncover may haunt you long after the video ends.